only a small part of his speech that he gave in 2017, and I'm very indebted to him for today's sermon. I believe he's probably one of the greatest moralists and prophets for justice in our time. He begins his speech this way. I want to begin on a note of piety. I come from a tradition that has everything to do with not just courage and vision and sacrifice and service to the least of these, but also with piety. Understand that piety is not blind faith to a dogma. It's not uncritical adherence to a doctrine. Rather, piety is defined as the sources of good in our lives. The sources of good in our lives. In our move from womb to tomb, our acknowledged dependence on those who came before. I am who I am because somebody loved me, somebody cared for me, and somebody attended to me. I'll never, ever forget it. I begin with piety because those who are serious about being all-season love warriors, not just sunshine soldiers in this moment of spiritual blackout and imperial meltdown, must begin with a critical historical inventory. Who are you really? How do you situate yourself in relation to traditions? Not one of us have one identity or one tradition. We're all hybrids all the way down. But you have to situate yourself in the best of those traditions so that you're able to sustain yourself in the face of the variety of catastrophes coming our way. There's the ecological catastrophe, the nuclear catastrophe, and we know the moral catastrophe is real, what I'm calling the relative eclipse of integrity, honesty, and decency, not just in this empire, but around the world. And what do I mean by moral catastrophe? We're not talking about politics, we're not talking about ideology, we're talking about spiritual blackout. Spiritual blackout is the normalizing of mendacity, that is dishonesty, to make lies appear as if they're part of the normal order of things. For example, we believe in justice, but not a justice that sends the Wall Street executive who engages in massive criminality of insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent activity, and predatory lending to jail. Spiritual blackout is naturalizing, normalizing of criminality. When crimes against humanity become part of the natural order of things. 1 out of 2 black children under 6 years old live in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. That's not just wrong, that's not just unjust, that's a certain kind of crime against humanity. Where is our public discussion about it? Where are the voices? Where's the moral outrage? Where's the righteous indignation? No, we just fit in. It's just business as usual. Drone strikes have been killing innocent children for the past 10 years, and yes, they were happening under our dear brother Barack Obama, whom so many fell in love with, becoming blind when it came to his complicity in war crimes. We normalize criminality. So this normalization is not just a matter of the new occupant of the White House. It's too easy to fetishize Donald Trump. But he is as American as apple pie. He just represents the worst of America. Don't isolate him. Don't act as if he dropped out of the sky. No, he comes from a very deep, organic traditions in this country. Phobias that make us lose sight of our precious trans brothers and sisters, of our bisexual folk and lesbians and gays, black people, indigenous people, Latinos, working people, across the board, moral catastrophe. Spiritual blackout not only normalizes mendacity and naturalizes criminality, it also encourages callousness. Rabbi Heschel says indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. So when we look at Donald Trump, we ought not to engage in sophomoric name-calling and finger-pointing that we get too often from the corporate media. We see what's really turning things, this market-driven predatory capitalism that's obsessed with short-term gains, that's obsessed with superficial success. What about spiritual issues, where greatness has to do with he or she who is serving the least of these, rather than just the smartest in the room? That's a sign of spiritual blackout. So when we look at Brother Donald Trump, we ought to also look inside ourselves. There are elements inside of us that need to be wrestled with. invite you this morning in a spirit of meditation to take some deep breaths and consider his words. What do we need to be wrestling with? What about spiritual issues where greatness has to do with he or she who is serving the least of these? So most of you in this congregation have been able to see me here every week saying be free. For those of you who are new here today, you may not realize this, but I've lost actually quite a lot of weight in the last year. Right? Thank you, I'm very proud of that. I think I'm somewhere around 80 pounds or something. And I got a long way to go yet. But if you've also been paying attention to me up here and my shrinkage that's been going on, you might have noticed in the last few months, I've kind of stalled out a little bit. Now, looking back, I can kind of see where it went wrong. Last fall, you see, I started lying to myself. Now, if you've ever been on a diet, you know these lies. You know these lies very well. They sound really harmless. They sound like little white lies. Things like, one more bite won't hurt, right? Or how about, you deserve it. You work hard. Let's celebrate. What I found was that over last fall, that voice became louder and louder. The problem with listening to these little white lies in my head is that they become a kind of slippery slope. Suddenly it's not one bite, but many bites. And then it's like, oh, I'll go back on it on Monday, and then it's after Christmas, I'll do that, right? And we ignore those other facts that are coming at us, like we just sort of avoid the scale on Sunday morning, right? We avoid the pants that start feeling a little bit tight. So then we start even avoiding thinking about it at all. We just don't even want to go there. Our mind just turns off. And then we're starting to gain back some of the weight that we lost. Anybody else have ever gone through this?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Not me.
Thank you. I'd like to know I'm not alone in this. And it feels like a kind of spiritual blackout, not in quite the sense that what West is talking about, but I found myself tuning out and turning off. I didn't want to deal with it, so now I've normalized kind of lying to myself. I've embraced this indifference. I'm focusing on those short-term gains, the joy of eating that piece of chocolate maybe, while ignoring my long-term goals of getting to a weight that I would like to be at. Spiritual blackout is, this kind of spiritual blackout is a very personal level, is kind of a metaphor, I think, for what's going on in our country today. We've normalized lying, which leads to normalizing criminality. We have a history in this country of telling ourselves lies like, hey, this country was built on hard work and the American dream. They sound really nice after all. We want it to be true. We deserve it. We've not wanted to hear the hard truths about how this country was also built through the obliteration of the native peoples, and it was built on the bedrock of slavery. We don't want to wrestle with the fact that these historical truths affect us still today. We don't want to get on that proverbial scale. And so cynicism and indifference battle within us among the barrage of media hype, trying to discern truths from the lies, and it can be really exhausting at times. And the last several weeks have in particular seems like this horrific slide into even more spiritual blackout, where we've been honoring a hate monger, the denying of truths and suppression of facts, and we've seen retaliation and revenge on those who told the truth. Our country, as Cornel West points out, is going through a spiritual blackout. He believes that there are 3 points to a spiritual blackout. One is that it normalizes mendacity, that is lying, and criminality. It encourages callousness and rewards indifference. It applauds short-term gains and superficial successes over long-term growth and spiritual depth. So my question is, well, how do we change this? How do we change course? Because I don't want to just endure it and just kind of like get through it. We've got to change this. How do we normalize integrity, honesty? How do we not lie to ourselves anymore, but face those hard truths? West believes that our country needs to go through, there's a fancy religious word for it, it's called metanoia. Metanoia is a conversion. That's religious language for radical change. And he begins with each one of us. We need to situate ourselves, find out who each one of us are deep inside, and live who that is. So how does he do this? He starts a little bit in his convocation. He talks about this. The first thing is piety, as that road to metanoia or conversion. Piety, as he says, remember, is not blind faith to a dogma. It's not uncritical adherence to doctrine. Rather, piety is defined as the sources of good in our lives. The sources of good in our lives. Piety is about connecting to that which is important to you and knowing who you are, to let it define you. So let me ask this, what is important to you? What's important to you? Where do you situate yourself? It's important to know who you are and who loved you into being. What traditions uphold you? So I'm going to just take a moment in that spirit of meditation again to consider, what are your sources of piety? I'm sure loved ones are there. What about values? What values are important to you? If you're having a hard time figuring out some values, here's some values for you to just meditate on. Which ones are more important to you? And you can tell the important ones because they ask something of you. Now, a better question might be, what kind of person do you want to be? Now, we might know that more intuitively than we do intellectually, right? Like, I know I want to be a good person. What does that mean, right? But that person is within you. Tapping into whatever it takes to ground you into that highest self is what will save you from sliding into that slippery slope of spiritual blackout. When we're connected to our sources of piety, that source of good in our lives, it asks something of us. It asks us to be that person that we want to be. And it may mean sacrificing something like comfort, which is why so many of us don't actually want to connect with it, right? Because then it means we have to sacrifice our comforts, and we're really good. We really like comfort. We want our chocolate. So many of us choose that comfort, that momentary bite of something yummy over the long-term goals. For example, anti-oppression work is like that. It's not comfortable, but the long-term goal is a really important one. Now, once you know who you want to be, and if you're like me, I loved his phrase, an all-season love warrior. I'm going to get a t-shirt that says that. I'm an all-season love warrior. But in order to get that, once you figure out who you are and who you want to be in this world, you're going to need fortitude. Now, West defines fortitude very carefully. It's not strength, it's not courage. As he points out, he says a neo-Nazi has courage. Fortitude is courage grounded in magnanimity, that is generosity. Okay? Fortitude grounded in generosity. Courage grounded in generosity. It's having that spiritual generosity tied to your courage and openness and humbleness orientation to the world. Fortitude is what gives you strength to become that person you want to be. It's a courage grounded in that generosity of spirit towards oneself and others. Because you see, there's this kind of civil war that goes on inside of all of us. Right? There's that one that says, oh, just have you deserve it. And then there's a, no, Sean, you can't have it. No, don't do that. And there's this war, this tug-of-war that goes on, these different parts of ourselves. And there's a civil war going on in each one of us for the short-term game of the bliss and ignorance. I don't want to deal with that, so I'm just going to ignore it. And the long-term goal of knowing, okay, growth, self-awareness. Fortitude helps us move toward what is good for us in the long run. The third thing we need to do for our metanoia is tell the truth. And it can be often really hard to do with the media shoving stuff down our throats constantly. But when we connect to our source of good and draw upon the fortitude it gives us, then we also have to face those hard truths. And that's the really hard part, right? We have to tell hard truths, all the truths, with openness and humility. We have to recognize and talk about the lies or the half-truths and tell all the truths, the other histories that we don't want to acknowledge. This means that we have to tell all the histories, not just the ones that make us feel better. It means we have to turn toward the sources of pain of the other, of someone who's different, and hear their stories, even if we don't want to hear about it. Now, I know this happens on all sides of the political spectrum, but I just have to point this one out because it made me sort of like, wow, okay. There was a woman being interviewed by a reporter, and she said, you can tell Trump hasn't done anything wrong, otherwise he'd be hiding things. The reporter said, well, if he were blocking witnesses, did you think that maybe he was hiding something? She replied, yeah, right. The reporter said, but he is blocking witnesses. And she replied, I don't care.
I saw that.
A difference comes when we don't want to face hard truths, when I don't want to get on that scale. That cognitive dissonance, right? is very uncomfortable. That's when two different worldviews or two different beliefs collide. One of them has to give way, and we tend to go to the ones that's the easiest to believe. Like, one bite won't hurt Sean. Facing our truths will take fortitude and that connection to that source of good that's inside of all of us. Then here's the last thing that we need, is solidarity. For Wes, solidarity means that we see the full humanity of every single person, even the ones that we dislike. We have to get beyond this either or, in or out thinking, this dualistic thinking, and come to a both and love kind of thinking. Bell Hooks is a wonderful Buddhist, a feminist. She says, to commit to love is to fundamentally to commit to a life beyond dualism. That's why love is so sacred in a culture of domination, because it simply begins to erode your dualisms, your ins, your outs. Solidarity also means that we don't look at short-term gains, but long-term goals. We can get so siloed, right? I think sometimes that we eat our young, right? We forget that sometimes that group over there has the same goal as my group over here, but we differ on one point, so screw your group. If we're going to get through this year, we're going to have to come together in solidarity. We're going to have to love and support one another. We have to become all-season love warriors. Because you know what also happened last fall? I made this connection. I stopped checking in with my community that supports me in my weight loss program. Now, this weight loss program that I follow is they've done white papers on this and studies on it. It is seriously the most successful weight loss program in the history of weight loss programs. But here's the fascinating thing. What it asks food-wise really isn't that different from other programs. That's not really what's radical about it. What's radical about it is that actually it creates this incredibly supportive community. That's actually the key. It's about the community. And all last year, I would check in with someone every single day, saying, okay, I'm committing to this program. And I supported other people on our journeys. I get in this group, we call them Gideon Games, it's kind of a funny thing, but we call, we text, we Marco Polo, whatever it was, WhatsApp. But last fall, I stopped because I told myself that little lie, oh, I'm too busy. I can do this on my own, right? Those are one of the worst lies we can tell ourselves. I can do this on my own. We need one another. And the role of religious community is to help us make sure we don't go down that slippery slope into our own spiritual blackout. Because here we tell the truth, even when it's hard. Community keeps us honest, if it's the right community. And here we encourage not callousness and indifference, but compassion, connection, and hope. Here we ask you not to get cynical, complacent, or indifferent, but to go for spiritual depth. We ask you to convert, to have metanoia, to change. The invitation is always there for us to become those all-season love warriors. And we do this in solidarity, even though our spiritual paths all differ. This community asks you to be that person you know you can be and go out and live it in the world. Now, this metaphor of me and my diet and spiritual blackout might be a little bit out there. I get that. One is personal, one's communal. But I believe it's part of the human condition, right? To battle, to wrestle with this civil war that's inside of all of us. Both are about each of us needing to stand in a place of integrity to be those all-season love warriors. And just so you know, I'm back on my weight loss program. And I'm back with my community. In fact, I'm actually leading a group of people this time because I figured this way also I'll give back. And that also keeps me accountable. It keeps me honest and in a sense of my own integrity of what I want to do and who I want to be. And it feels a lot less lonely on the journey. You know, this nation, it was founded on wonderful, incredible ideals. Freedom, liberty, justice, ideals that we have yet to live up to. This great experiment of democracy will either thrive or fail based on whether or not we are willing to make these changes. And I believe that nothing less than the soul of our nation is at stake. Because I don't believe we can make America great again, because it never did live up to its ideals. It never was just great when it ignored the suffering of others. But we can make America great one day. We can become the country we want to be. And it will take each of us, every one of us, to build it together. Let us go be all-season love warriors.